So hello again and welcome those who joined us now. I'm Limor Chen and I'll be chairing this session. How are speciesism, sexism, racism, and environmental destruction related? Do men and women have distinct relationships with animals? Are there similarities between the treatment of women and nature in various societies? And what role does patriarchy play in multi-species relations? All these questions and more will be discussed in this panel, Ecofeminism, Gender, and Animals. The panel will include 3 presentations, followed by a discussion and Q&A. You're welcome to write down questions and comments in the chat box during the presentations. And please write to who you are addressing your comment or question. Unfortunately, Professor Nir Avieli is not feeling well and couldn't participate. So Adas Marcus kindly agreed to give her presentation instead. Our first presenter for this panel is Shlomit Simchi from Tel Aviv University.
Thank you very much, Limor. Today I will talk about ecofeminist autoethnography in human-animal relations. Approximately 2 million street cats live in Israel, perhaps even more. Hundreds of thousands of kittens are born each year, doomed to hunger, diseases, suffering, and early death, especially in the peripheral areas of northern and southern Israel. Street animals and cats in particular occupy urban spaces and are often associated with dirt, garbage cans, diseases, and poverty. The dominant social and cultural perception of street cats ranges from estrangement to disgust and hatred, making it difficult to adapt an adequate institutional approach. The deteriorating situation of street cats, lack of proper legislation, and the collapse of animal welfare organizations have led to the rise of mostly female cat feeders. Among them are nursing foster caretakers, trappers, and network activists. In recent years, street cats and their feeders have become a hotly debated issue in Israeli street and in human-nature relations. In this presentation, I will share my experience as a cat feeder living in an urban periphery seeking to conduct a feminist human-animal research in a patriarchal academy. I will focus on one episode in which I witnessed how my otherness was manifested through my relationship with street cats, which themselves perceived as the ultimate other. As Kalanit Tzalach points out, talking about otherness begins with the researcher herself. Therefore, I use an autoethnographic research method to promote social understanding through self-experience. So why use autoethnography, and what does human-animal ecofeminist thinking have to do with it? Autoethnography is a qualitative research method which relies upon critical social and cultural analysis of personal experience and feelings. It is an academic genre in which the researcher's self-experience represents the cultural, and the self become a mediating tool for understanding the institutional and the social collective. Feminist autoethnography turns personal stories into political reality by exposing inequalities and the complex emotional culture within power relations. Thus, emotions, relationship, and personal experiences are central features of autoethnography and a legitimate way to share knowledge. Autoethnography is a postmodern type of research that allows for the absence of an essential self and replaces it with a reflexive self. Hence, the focus on the word auto and not self or I, that is, our self dimension is turned outwards to the other and to additional elements that enable a mutual point of view. It is a kind of ethnography of the self, but in relation to others and the social, political, and economic power system in which it is embedded, and that it constitutes a relativistic methodology. And yet, autoethnography has remained a humanistic in its orientation, and only recently the concept of multi-species autoethnography has emerged, dealing with the self-experience in relation to other species and how these are affected by structural forces. Autoethnography corresponds to ecofeminist animal ethics of care, as it recognizes the diversity and uniqueness of each creature and species and demands that humans strive to acknowledge the singularity of different animals, their individual suffering, and the political and economic system liable for this suffering. The recognition of ecofeminist theorists has led them to rely upon the emotional connection between human and animals, They argue that sympathy, care, and compassion are the basis for constructing a theory of animal care, and that the personal feelings and experiences are vital to moral decision-making. In fact, feminist care theory aims to bring emotions as well as their communications and responses to the center of philosophical debate and to validate them as authentic state of knowledge. Autoethnography makes this possible. As a method that pays close attention to interpersonal, emotional, and physical experiences, vulnerability and instability, ethics of care is at the heart of autoethnography. So how did I become a cat feeder? My personal story. It's 5 o'clock in the afternoon and I'm walking home from the market on a busy main street. People are scurrying everywhere. As I walk the sidewalk, I suddenly hear some indistinct noise that keeps getting louder. I stop, I turn around and I see nothing. Many people walk around me, drivers are rushing and honking, and yet the noise gets clearer and louder, like a shout. But if no one has stopped, I think it's probably nothing. I keep walking, but this voice is unrelenting, so I retrace my steps, I start searching, following the noise, and trying to figure out where it's coming from. I head towards some green bins located outside a row of shops. I see at least 6 cats foraging for food in the bins. As soon as they see me, they run away in panic, of course. I'm surprised at how skinny and dirty they are. One cat has an infected eye, another has a cropped tail and missing fur, and another looks pregnant. She watches me for a long time and then slowly approaches and cries in hungry despair. I remember my Lily, who passed away exactly a year and a half ago. We had lived together for 20 years. My sister and I found her near our building, a small, black, wet, and frightened kitten. We hid her in our room upstairs until our parents were finally forced to accept her, much to their displeasure. But the painful memory of her terrible illness comes back, flooding me with a sharp longing for my Lily. I had not yet located the source of the noise. I put down my shopping bags and start looking. It comes from the bins. What the hell is that? I open one of the bins and dig into it with my bare hands. I detect movement inside a tightly closed black bag and pick it up. Ripping the bag apart, I find 2 little kittens, maybe a month old. Who would do such a thing? I'm shaking and I'm shocked. How did they manage to make any noise at all? How did they survive? I hold them to my chest, my mind is racing. What should I do? According to the Cartesian thought, matter is lifeless and inferior to the mind, spirit, or logic. Therefore, animals were reduced to being objects or machines. Also in the Marxist thought, it was argued that animals are driven by instinct and survival needs and that they act in a fixed and genetically predetermined manner. These anthropocentric notions not only drain animals of subjectivity, personality, meaning, and passion for life, but also allow unimportant creatures to be thrown away like trash. Animal objectification takes place not only when humans eat or exploit them, but also when animals serve no purpose or their existence interferes with urban landscape. Theories of the city emphasize how it is a human and cultural creation that stand in stark contrast to wild nature. In the biopolitical processes of exclusion and sorting, animals have been removed or exterminated throughout history to protect human and urban health, or sometimes have been socialized and introduced into human society. Street cats are located at the fringes of urban civilization. They are perceived as real or imagined threat to human population, and this is reflected in the marginal, neglected, and dirty environmental spaces they occupy. Animals that cross the boundary between civilization and nature or between public and private deviate from the rhythmic space and evoke negative emotions such as contempt and discomfort. Thus, spaces that street cats inhabit also signify how nature penetrates the city and becomes sites of conflict and affect their acceptance or rejection. Their disbelonging and otherness allows, among other things, the abandonment of street cat, their vulnerability and death. Moreover, their otherness reflects mine as well. Many people passed me by on the street and saw me crying as I held the kittens in a state of helplessness. Still, no one stopped to ask, check, maybe offer some help. This experience revealed to me harsh truths about the hegemonic violence against animals and the extent of our partnership or involvement in it. It also showed me how society and culture fails to relate the non-human by establishing man-made hierarchies about certain forms of life. This experience was a moment where I could not only mark the otherness of animals in the urban space, but also identify how their otherness and transparency intersect with my own. Back to the story. I immediately called the municipal hotline and report the incident. The call center answered indifferently. Your request has been forwarded. In up to 3 hours, a patrolman will arrive, and if necessary, he will call a veterinary inspector to collect them. They do not have 3 hours, I thought. Listen, I tried to explain. These are very small kittens, and they are probably in respiratory distress. She replied impatiently that this was the protocol, and if they are so young and nursing, they would be killed anyway because no one can take care of them. I hung up the phone in panic. What now? These are not people that I'm holding. These are street cats, garbage cats. Feeling it was urgent, I called a taxi service. The kitten clung to me with the last ounce of their strength. Their eyes are closed and they are breathing heavily. At the same time, I remember Lily's final breath and how I laid beside her all night until she died. The taxi arrives and takes me to our vet. The line is so long. I burst in crying. This is emergency. Dr. Amit looks at the kitten with tired eyes and sighs, Shlomit, they have no chance. They were without oxygen and food for too long. I get upset and reply angrily, what do you mean they have no chance? Try, rescue them. My body is shaking with grief and I can't understand what is happening to me. He gazes at me and says, I don't have the right equipment. They need oxygen. It is very difficult for kittens to survive here in our street. That's the reality. It's better if we just kill them. I ignored his word, take them and rush to the nearest vet hospital. On the way, I apologize to the kittens and pray for them to stay alive. When I get to the emergency room and place them on the treatment table, the vet examines them for less than a minute and declares, Miss, they are dead. After this incident, I started seeing and hearing cats on the street, actually everywhere. I started feeding and caring for them and became acquainted with a large network of women caring for street cats. At the same time, I became aware of the cultural stereotypes that cat-feeding women are paged with. Feeding cats is often seen as an eccentric act, suggesting mental illness carried out by women with no purpose in life. These women are not valued or rewarded for their care work, but are accused of trying to elevate distress, pain, and loneliness, or of being too lazy to lead a normative life. Feeding cats comes at the expense of raising children, engaging in domestic activities, or contributing to the labor market, and thus interferes with the heteronormative and capitalist patriarchal order. These perceptions directly impact the authorities' attitudes toward feeders and the cats themselves. Since then, and in many other conversations I have had with the municipality about injured cats in need of medical care, I have encountered mostly contempt and have been ridiculed for caring about the life of street cats. I discovered that death is the preferred solution for municipal services that Anticlair seek to reduce the cat population in Israel and not in a respectful manner. Feeding cats, therefore, is not perceived as an activity of political and ethical importance and does not receive adequate public attention, nor is it considered as an academic or feminist issue. Autoethnography, which is often seen as a provocative research method that allows for defiant, liberating, and seemingly less academic writing, permits studying topics that are not considered fully legitimate. If feminism is still perceived as a marginal science in some places in the world, ecofeminist studies, and particularly feminist animal studies, are even more marginal. Ecofeminist autoethnography allows me to put at the center of the analysis my human, feminine, emotional experience while interacting with the animal, felon, non-human one. Autoethnography also allows my multiple intersectional identity as a Mizrahi feminist, environmental and animal rights activist and researcher, and as a cat feeder to be heard in the face of Stalinist voices, academic and non-academic. To conclude, autoethnography is not just a process of reporting of personal experiences, but also a guideline for action related to what those experiences can do in the world. According to Catherine Gillespie, one of the key questions in multi-species autoethnography is how this method can benefit other species and create a fairer and more caring world for those who are subjected to normalized violence, instrumentalization, and dispossession. As my experience has shown, autoethnography enables me to locate ecofeminist practices of care for street animals as actions of ethical, social, and political value. And as such, autoethnography has the potential to expose more ethical ways of living and being in the world. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Shlomit, for bringing this important issue. And while you were talking, I was watching the cats of Tel Aviv University from my window. They were jumping and walking around. So they seem to be fed well. So that more optimistic view than what you were talking about, unfortunately. Our next presenter is Yael Shemesh from Bar-Ilan University. Yael, you can start sharing your slides.
Okay, good afternoon. In the beginning of her work, The Sexual Politics of Meat, Carol Adams writes that she used to think that there is no connection between feminism and being a vegetarian, but ultimately realized that she had been wrong. The book ties the oppression of animals by eating meat to patriarchal culture. Also, Jacques Derrida addresses the connection between patriarchal culture and animals' exploitation in various publications of his. In an article on feminist Bible research, I classified the research methods into two: militant feminist research as opposed to mediating feminist research, as I call them. The division is, of course, overly dichotomous, and it should be kept in mind that there is a continuum of approaches and that things are more complex. Nevertheless, I will present the extremist positions. The militant research rejects the authority of the Bible and is unwilling to accept it as a culture-establishing text. It emphasizes that the Bible is patriarchal and, according to some scholars, even misogynic, that is, infected with contempt for women. Mediating research, on the other hand, seeks to bridge between the ancient text, the Bible, and the modern phenomenon known as feminist ideology by illuminating and focusing on positive elements in the Bible's attitude toward women. In this lecture, I wish to show that the same division also exists with regard to the study of ethical behavior toward animals in the Bible. But first, it is appropriate to ask, what is the basis for the comparison between the study of women and the study of animals in the Bible? Due to shortage of time, I will enumerate only the main points. First, focusing on the fringes. Although it's the Hebrew man that stands at the center of the Bible's attention, these two ways of research, the feminist and the animal ethics related, focus on the fringes, women or animals, who despite their being on the fringes, are mentioned already in the first chapter of the book of Genesis. Second, demanding justice, equality between the genders, and justice across biological species towards inhuman animals. Third, culture versus nature. The division, men are identified with culture and women with nature, and we heard about it from Lori, is prevalent in cultures and is also found in the Bible. The woman is likened to soil in which the male buries his seed. An affinity is thus created between women and animals, because the animals, of course, belong to the natural world. The result is the justification of man's rule over women and the rule of human beings over the animals, and conceiving them as reflecting the natural order of things, as Edna Gorney wrote in her book, Exploited and Protected. Fourth, objects, property, and wages. Animals and women are sometimes described as a property of men. The salary of Jacob is paid in both women and animals, cattle. His wives also have animal names, Rachel, sheep, and Leah, which probably means cow on the basis of Arabic and Akkadian. Also the commandment, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his manservant, or maidservant, or his ox, or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor, Exodus 20, creates a clear affinity between women and animals. The man is the subject, while the animals and the women are the object, the property of the man, like the house and the slaves, which a man must not covet if they are not his. We will now demonstrate the ways of copying of feminist Bible research and of animal ethics research and analyze the points of similarity between them. We will begin with the militant research. First, the Bible is accused of being the source of Western society's bad treatment of women or animals. God established a relationship of inequality between the genders after the sin in Genesis 3, and God established human rule over the animals already in Genesis 1. Second, there being servants, Ezer Kenegdo. Women and animals were created with the purpose of serving men and human beings, respectively. Third, name giving. The fact that Adam gave names to the animals and to Eve is perceived as an expression of control. Fourth, the Bible presents the woman and an animal, the serpent, as partners in the first human sin. In doing so, they brought disaster on the human race. Perhaps the name Chava is derived from Aramaic chivia, serpent. The resemblance between their names emphasizes the resemblance between the woman and the snake. Next, the Bible employs anthropocentric or patriarchal language that deteriorates animals or women into the function they serve for those who use them. Carol Adams points out that the word flesh is a symbol of what is not seen but always found, the animal killed in order to turn it into flesh. Language causes the animals themselves to be absent from the discussion of flesh. The word flesh, in the sense of meat, appears many times in the Bible and is used to this day. And with regard to women, for example, the word for female, nekeva, which appears already in the first creation story, Genesis 1, male and female, nekeva, created them, refers to the woman as a whole, nekev, that serves the sexual and reproductive needs of the male. Regrettably, the word is still in use in modern Hebrew, and a suitable alternative has yet to be found. We now turn from militant research to mediated research in order to analyze the points of resemblance between feminist research and animal ethics research. First, relativity. Mediating feminist research will emphasize that the status of women in the Bible was relatively good compared to the patriarchies common in the countries of the ancient Near East. The Bible presents moderate patriarchy compared to them. Also, animal ethics research will emphasize that the status of animals in the Bible is higher than the one reflected in the countries of the ancient Near East. Laws protecting animals, such as letting them rest on the Shabbat, or the prohibition against muzzling an ox while it is threshing, are not known from the neighboring countries of ancient Israel. Second, fertility blessing. The woman is blessed together with the man, while the animals are blessed even before the humans. Third, the giving of names may be understood to indicate connection, closeness, and intimate familiarity, and not control. Fourth, partnership in the covenant with God. Women are part of the community. They took part in the covenant ceremonies. Animals too are part of the community, and the covenant of the rainbow includes them as well. Quote, I will remember my covenant between me and you and every living creature of every kind, in Genesis 9. Next, the existence of a golden age, embracing the lost paradise. The mediating feminist study will emphasize the egalitarian description of the creation of man and woman in Genesis 1:27. Male and female created in them. Phyllis Triebel also found egalitarian foundations in the description of the creation of woman in chapter 2. The study of animal ethics will also emphasize the good relationship between humans and animals in the Garden of Eden, and the fact that the first 10 generations lived on a plant-based diet. Sixth, the corruption was caused by the sin. According to Triebel and others, only as a result of the sin was the equality between men and women interrupted, and God established a relationship of inequality between them and men's rule over women. According to animal ethics research, it can be suggested that only following the sin was the good relationship between humans and animals interrupted. After the sin, God dresses Adam and Eve in garments of skin, which in fact symbolizes the alienation between humans and non-human animals. That is, the corruption of this relationship was not included in God's initial intention, but it is a defect. And the aspiration should be to correct this defect, to mend the world, or in Hebrew, tikkun olam. And finally, advancing humanity. On the other hand, one could also argue that the woman and the serpent promoted the human race to the level of maturity and civilization, culture, and social order. Despite the above-mentioned points of resemblance, there are, of course, also differences between feminist research and animal ethics research of the Bible, and I will mention only two differences. First, comparison between past and present, progress or retreat. Today, in many countries, the status of women has improved dramatically in comparison to their status in the Bible. In contrast, when it comes to the status and well-being of animals, one would do well to cling to the past and to the Bible, as there is a huge difference between the conditions enjoyed by animals in biblical times and those to which they are exposed in modern food industries. In biblical times, a personal relationship existed between man and the animals he raised. And especially scholars leaning toward mediating research will quote verses such as, "A righteous man has regard for the soul of his beast," which teach about the personal relationship that existed between biblical man and the animals he possessed. Second, the degree of exploitation. The exploitation of animals for personal and ritual purposes, eating them, stripping their skins, sacrificing them, is almost irrelevant regarding the treatment of women. Certainly women were not eaten and their skin was not stripped. As Carol Adams writes, eating meat is the most intense and common form of oppression. I will add that also egg industry and the dairy industry. In conclusion, the study of animal ethics in the Bible has been influenced by feminist research, and as I have tried to show, there are many similarities between the two with regard to both the militant approach as well as to the mediating approach. Despite the similarity, there are, of course, significant differences between the way the Bible treats women and the way it treats animals, as well between the way women and animals were treated in the Bible and the way they are treated in modern culture. Not surprisingly, the animals are always treated worse. These significant differences constitute the reason why, if I had to decide whether to invest my time in the struggle for equal rights for women, which is a very important struggle, or in the struggle for an ethical treatment of animals, I would choose the second option because of the simple fact that the animals constitute the most oppressed group on earth, as noted by Adams, and also because this group is unable to fight its struggle on its own, but needs human beings to fight struggle on its behalf. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yael. And the third presenter for this panel is Adas Marcus from Tel Aviv University.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for having me. I wanted to first wish Nir a speedy recovery. I'm replacing him, but I'm sorry he can't be with us. And to thank Shlomit and Yael for your wonderful talks. And to say that, Lori, you have been a great inspiration to me because I relied quite a bit on your work in some writing I've done, for example, an article on elephants in captivity. And I see here's the book that you co-wrote with Carol J. Adams on my first slide. So I'm happy it's there. Okay, the title of my talk is Where Gender Meets Animal Suffering, Ecofeminist Discourse on Hunting and Vivisection. So I'm going to concentrate on those two aspects. And not all the examples I will use, I would call them ecofeminists. However, they are women who are struggling in the struggle for animal rights. So I figured that they would be fitting. So ecofeminism has really taken off, as Lori has told us. Here's her book, Entangled Empathy, in the middle, and so many books have come out, so many academic studies, and I'm so happy to see that it is a thriving academic discipline. And ecofeminism can take many, many different forms, and it's not something new. It's been around for quite some time. It's quite universal. I will be talking, using examples from Marty Keel, who is late Marty Keel, who started the Feminists for Animal Liberation. And it also comes from women from many, many different backgrounds. Here I have an example of Vandana Shiva, who says the patriarchal system is killing the future, and Wangara Maathai, who established the Greenbelt movement in 1977 and planted many, many thousands of trees with women. When we plant trees, we plant the seeds of peace and hope. I had the good fortune of meeting Greta Gard when I was at a conference many years ago and corresponding with her. And I also love her work. Her work emerges from the intersections of anti-racist feminisms, environmental justice, and critical animal studies. And she does quite a bit with animal welfare. I'm just giving a little bit of background, but we've encounter what I would call different forms or suggestions, maybe allusions to ecofeminism everywhere in popular culture as well, even from Walt Disney. We see some of these women who I would very much put into Lori's third strand of the ethics of care, like Belle from Beauty and the Beast, Jasmine from Aladdin with her friendly tiger, and Pocahontas talking to the grandmother Willow Tree, and also accompanied by a raccoon and rabbits and squirrel. Perhaps, I'm not sure if I'm correct on this, but one of the most classic pieces of ecofeminism, and very well known by Carol J. Adams, is the Sexual Politics of Meat, where really this theory of feminist vegetarian critical theory took off, and comparing how women's bodies are often analogous to the way a cow is treated, also in terms of reproductive technologies and meat eating and just the parts of a woman's flesh. So first I want to talk about hunting, and we have here an image of women protest, all women protesters, stop hunting and trapping, a woman dressed up in the costume of a fox protesting in the UK because fox hunting had become very controversial. And perhaps the antithesis I would think of ecofeminism is what Brigitte Bardot used to be when she was, this very hot sex symbol, screen legend. But after a number of years, she got sick of being interpreted and thought of in this way, and she created a new image for herself, and that was an animal rights activist. And actually, she has been one for decades. And perhaps you're familiar with this very famous poster of her hugging a baby harp seal, because there was a practice which has really, really gone down and practically eliminated, of clubbing these baby seals to death, and very, very dramatic images of the blood all over the snow from Greenpeace. And so she made it her mission to try to stop this terrible fur trade. But on the other end of the spectrum, you could have someone like Joy Williams, who had the guts, I would say, to write and be published in Esquire magazine, which is an American man's magazine, a very macho magazine. And she described how she felt about trophy hunters. And she said, for hunters, hunting is fun. They kill for play, for entertainment. They kill for the thrill of it, to make an animal theirs. They want to own it. Alive, the beast belongs only to itself, and this is unacceptable. He's yours, he's mine. Hunters like beautiful creatures, a beautiful deer, elk, bear, cougar, bighorn, and sheep. And this desire to own the beautiful is very suggestive of the way some men also relate to women. One of my heroes, and I'm very, very sad to say, I am now 64, so I'm older than the age she was when she died, is Marty Keel. She was a wonderful ecofeminist and very, very much loved. She died of a form of leukemia. And I'm going to talk about her and also derive, I'm going to read a little bit from two pieces that she wrote, one on hunting and one on vivisection. So when she passed away a year later, there was this outpouring of love for her, and a conference was held in her honor at Wesleyan University, where Lori is. And her close friends and colleagues, and again, Lori was one of them, and Josephine Donovan, Batya Bauman, and Carol J. Adams commemorated her with tributes in a conference. And they said Marty's ethic was one of active, engaged, empathic care. So I guess she would be in the third strand that Lori described, not selfish or selfless caretaking. And while she was critical of many, her compassion always extended to them. She was a genuine philosopher, a lover of wisdom, of learning, and of debate. And just the descriptions of her are so beautiful. She advocated a nonviolent, emotionally responsive, holistic, and non-dominative ethic by which humans may live in harmony with nature and non-human creatures. So this was the conference. And she's very well known for her book, Nature Ethics, which is an ecofeminist perspective on nature. And again, Greta Gard described this book as she's a major figure in ecofeminism. Marty Keel's original thinking offers vital insights into the destructive consequences of a detached masculine self-identity and a path toward the development of a genuinely inclusive nature ethic that respects all living beings. And Carol J. Adams said nature ethics is a major contribution to ecofeminist philosophy, animal liberation, and environmental ethics. So in one book from 1995, she had a chapter called License to Kill, and this is about hunting, an ecofeminist critique of the hunter's discourse. And there she spoke about, in the opening pages of Nature Ethics, this is her own book, not the same chapter, she outlined what she felt were kind of masculine qualities that required dominance and violence, and they were involved in hunting. There were things that were expressed through hunting. And so one of them, there were a whole list of about 10 things. I selected just 3. A belief that men in particular are driven by aggressive, self-centered biological drives that requires controlled, rational expression. A belief in the superiority of sport over spontaneous play, and subordinating concern for individual creatures to larger constructs. In Nature Ethics, much later on, this is already on page 92, she wrote, the idea that hunting is a sport contains a number of conceptual flaws, which seem to elude 19th century hunters. Sport is typically conceived as a voluntary agreement among participants to follow mutually agreed upon goals. Well, obviously, the animal has not mutually agreed to be pursued and to be shot and even killed. This is a painting by Bruna Lilliefors, who did a lot of work about hunting paintings. She also wrote, Marty Keel also wrote an article called The Killing Game, just like Joy Williams did. an ecofeminist critique of hunting. And in it, this was in the Journal of the Philosophy of Sport, she said, the big quote at the bottom, ecofeminist philosophy requires a crucial distinction that hunters overlook. It is one thing to accept the reality and necessity of death, and quite another to deliberately kill a living being. And she talks about the fact that the hunter feels he steps into, in his imagination, he develops feelings of empathy for the animal. He kind of steps into the animal's umwelt, when in fact, she says this is impossible because he couldn't possibly feel the terror and fright that the animal experiences. Now, something else I want to talk about, and I'm sorry that I'm going back and forth quite a bit, but that's the way this talk is structured. Another thing that Marty Keel wrote about was animal experiments, or vivisection. So this is a movement, women going against anti-vivisection movement, which started centuries ago. It was a very strong one. It started in the UK. And I'm going to also quote Marty and also talk to you as much as time allows a little bit about the history of this movement. And before I get to Marty, though, I wanted to just kind of share the kind of typical image here in this painting from 1832 by Emile Edouard Moschi, where, in the dark, a whole audience of men are, operating on this dog who has not been anesthetized, and he's obviously suffering very badly, and the men seem oblivious to its suffering. And here's a similar image, supposedly of Claude Bernard, who was a very famous vivisector, showing again a group of men who are either very interested or just talking to each other, but seem again to be unaware of the suffering of this rabbit. So in the World Day, getting back to Marty, and the World Day for Laboratory Animals, which falls on April 24th, 2 days after Earth Day, she gave a speech at UC Berkeley in 1997. And activists had been very worried for 2 decades about these langur monkeys that had been housed at the Berkeley lab for a very long time. And a year after she gave this speech, they were actually transferred to a sanctuary after a very, very long fight. And just a quote from this very moving speech that she gave was, "World Day for Laboratory Animals is a time for remembering the pain and suffering of hundreds of thousands of animals in laboratories throughout the world, whose lives and deaths count only as data to be recorded. But it is also a time for expressing our outrage at the pain and anguish that animals in laboratories endure as they are poisoned, cut, jabbed, injected, dissected, and otherwise manipulated and abused." So now I'm going to kind of rewind, going back in history to honor these women who started this movement, this anti-vivisection crusade. And they were very brave to do so, and they were ridiculed on many levels. Most of them were suffragists. They were also fighting for women's rights at the same time, and human rights on different levels. So they were a driving force behind the anti-vivisection movement, and they held meetings and protests. Perhaps the most famous one was Frances Power Cobb. She was an Anglo-Irish social reformer, and she actually started a couple of organizations, among them the National Anti-Vivisection Society and the British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection, which is now, there's another organization that's similar, different name. Perhaps the most famous event that happened was the Brown Dog Affair, and a statue was erected to honor this dog that had been vivisected. Again, it had been operated on again and again in a laboratory, and finally died after much suffering. And so in 1906, the statue was erected, and then it was destroyed, and then a new one was put up in 1985. But in the meanwhile, there was a lot of protest and struggle. And this dog, it had been vivisected. This is not the same one, by William Bayliss, and he was a very, very notorious lecturer he enjoyed shocking audiences with these terrible, very, very painful experiments he performed. So several Swedish feminists of the University of London infiltrated the lectures, and they are actually the ones who instigated battles, such as this protest you see here. Coral Lansbury has written quite a bit, and she said, when anti-vivisectionists witnessed these demonstrations, they felt as they were in the presence of a new pornography, and all the animals stretched out writhing on boards were like women on the gynecologist table or bound to some chair. And Margot de Mello gives a similar kind of idea, saying suffragists saw the cruelty of vivisection. Feminists could not help but see the parallels between the treatment of women who were in those days strapped down during childbirth and forced to have hysterectomies and animals. But just as I close, I want to say there are men who do care very deeply for animals and for the environment. And I really recommend this book that was given to me by one of the authors. So I don't want to just say only women care. The stories and essays in this book leave one who ingested a healthy meal of ecofeminist writing surprised, pleasantly surprised, to be reminded that men are even capable of being positive figures in the environment. And just to remind you that one of the great defenders of animal rights was actually Mark Twain. And Shelley Fisher-Fishkin has written quite a bit about it. He said, "I'm not interested to know whether vivisection produces results that are profitable to the human race. The pain which it inflicts upon unconsenting animals is the basis of my enmity toward it. And it is sufficient justification of the enmity without looking further." And he was a great inspiration to the author Elizabeth Stuart Phelps, who also supported very greatly the anti-vivisection campaign in her literature. Okay, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Adat, for a beautiful presentation, as always. I am now happy to introduce our discussant for this panel, ecofeminist Dr. Edna Gorny from Haifa University.
Can you see it okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I wrote two books that are pertinent to this talk. And first of all, I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for inviting me to respond to these very interesting 3 lectures, and I will try to bring them together. Different topics, but all obviously connected through the ecofeminist thinking. I wrote 2 books, both of them in Hebrew. The first one came out in 2011, and it's entitled Exploited and Protected, Ecofeminist Theory of Nature, Culture, and Society in Israel. It is the first book in Hebrew that used ecofeminist theory to look at those relations in Israel. And it's for the general public, okay? So I am an ecologist by training, and I already made a first step towards bridging between worlds, okay, between scientific world and people that live outside the scientific world and don't read wonderful papers about ecofeminist thought. So my first book was meant for the general public, and I also used my own experience in working in the Hula Nature Reserve during the 79-80. This was before the area was reflooded, and the Hula Reserve is a symbol of something that was done supposedly for the benefit of human beings in the very young state of Israel. It was an extended wetland drained in the early 50s. And that later on turned out that it was an ecological disaster. So I used that symbol to look further into how we related to nature in Israel. In the second book, which came out in 2020, entitled Zoological Portrait Lexicon, I incorporated art and knowledge, incorporated reason and feelings and emotions, as Laurie talked about. It's a book, it's literature, but it uses animals. Each chapter is a name of an animal. And I write from my own experience, but very different things about animals. And I give the animals the main stage. So sometimes some of the chapters are critical essays, some are poetry, some are poetic prose. So I very much accept this idea that we need to bring art into science and mix the two. And in this book, I also use my meetings with specific animals, as was discussed earlier. Okay, so I remember meeting one bonobo female as I was sitting in the San Diego Zoo breastfeeding my baby, and a bonobo female came to the window, and all the bonobo females followed her, and they all watched me breastfeeding on the other side of the glass, breastfeeding my baby. And the people that were with me at the other side of the glass noticed that something is happening, and they all became quiet. And there was a moment where the female bonobo, the oldest, put her hand on the window, and I put my hand on the other side of the window. And I shudder every time I repeat this story, no matter how many times, because years later, I wrote about that meeting and about our right to imprison those animals. And remembering that we've imprisoned not only animals, also people that we treated as others, okay? So I'll continue with, I will go over it quickly because Lori did such a great job of explaining what ecofeminism is, but talking about domination of women, nature, and native, ecofeminist theory criticizes hierarchical dualistic constructs that shape domination, and they also justify it. This is what's so amazing with the ecofeminist critique, because it has discovered that those constructs are also justified by the same mechanism that built them. So those dualisms can go on forever. They're based on the main maybe pair of me and the other. The other can be my neighbor. It could be the other belonging to a different political group, a different ethnic group, a different national group. Another dualism, of course, is culture versus nation, or versus nature, sorry, or humans versus animals, male versus females, colonialist versus native, mind or reason versus emotions or body. And the list goes on forever. And what happens is that those on top are being identified with each other, as well as those at the bottom. So women or females are identified with nature, with being the other, the ultimate other compared to men. They are body, right, for sexual reasons and for procreation. And natives are similar because they're also similar to animals, et cetera, et cetera. Those at the top dominate those at the bottom, and those at the top enjoy privileges. And therefore, they struggle against the deconstruction of this big construct. And we see that the earth is described as a feminine entity, which is not in of itself something negative. However, this identification of woman as nature, nature as woman, and woman as a boundless giver and nourisher, but also a very powerful destroyer, justifies controlling and taming. So the man is the civilizer, the tamer, and the owner. This is a citation from Val Plumwood. In dualistic construction, as in hierarchy, the qualities, actual or supposed, the culture, the values, and the areas of life associated with the dualized other are systematically and pervasively constructed and depicted as inferior. And that constructs this logic of domination, which I referred to earlier. So ecofeminism thought identified this logic of domination. Of course, it's good for men to control women because they're unable. Of course, it's good for the colonialists to control natives because they're unable. and they're also resources, etc., etc. And this way of thinking is very, very old, and it's not only in the Old Testament. This is quoting Aristotle, who wrote, "The male is by nature superior and the female inferior, and the one rules and the other is ruled. This principle of necessity extends to all mankind." Okay, so he talked about males and females. He talked about slaves versus their owners. He talked about animals versus their human owners. Okay, and just accepted at face value that one is superior, one is inferior, and therefore the logic of domination. Simone de Beauvoir wrote earlier, before the term ecofeminism even was thought of, in 1947, she noticed the similarity of ownership over the land and over women. It's all quote from her book, The Second Sex. "When he became owner of the land, he claimed also ownership of woman. A man conquers and possesses a woman, and as he does the land. He penetrates and fertilizes both the land and women." So I thought about this panel, and really the talks evolved around canonical sacred texts, practices of connection and compassion, critique of separation, hierarchy, and polarization, and discussed different aspects of femininity, masculinity, and knowledge, and the damage caused by not seeing the full picture. As Laurie mentioned earlier, not every activist has to deal with all the aspects, but the knowledge that they're all connected has to be there. And so women as a resource, as a resource for babies or for sex, slaves, and animals. Who will talk on behalf of them? And I just want to mention here two quotes. An enemy is a person, and I added living organism, whose story we have not heard. This is something very, very important, because we tell stories. Scientists tell stories and artists tell stories, and it's all about storytelling. And if we know somebody, it's very hard then to be their enemies. And another quote from the American writer Grace Paley, but we do have that other way of understanding, a revolutionary understanding that we call feminist and ecological, in which we share the world with all creatures and all living things and know that their stories are our own. Okay, so that connection that is severed by the dualistic hierarchical thought, and ecofeminism tries to reweave. This quote is from Weaving the World, Irene Diamond and Gloria Ornstein. What happens? So there are many marginalized and excluded groups, and the similarities are that these are excluded from production of knowledge. Those that produce the knowledge justify this exclusion, and those that produce the knowledge also define those that lack knowledge. It reminds me of Virginia Woolf when she was asked to talk about women, and she went to the library and she describes very ironically that all the books about women were written by men, and she couldn't find any that were written by women. So of course, who produces the knowledge and who describes the other? And the viewpoints of the excluded are unknown and unheard, and the knowledge serves the interests of those that dominate. So again, talking about different kind of texts, and science as a storyteller has its own very powerful stories, talking about what Laurie mentioned, the importance of reason, right? So science is considered the reason is its holy grail. Evelyn Fox Keller did a fascinating reading of Bacon from the 17th century. It's a time where modern science emerged. And Bacon claimed that the aim of that new science is to control nature and use it for humans' benefit and needs. He also said that the relations between scientists and nature are similar to a marriage between man and woman. So obviously science at the top, nature at the bottom. And the new science is going to be masculine and rational, and we will replace the old science. The old science was the alchemy. Okay, so the scientific methods, which are also ideologies, they're not just methods, is objectivity and the need to be objective and unbiased, which is something we may strive for. We cannot achieve it. It's very difficult to achieve it when we study people or relations of people to other groups. Based on separation, there's no room exclusion of feelings, which of course it's really impossible to do, but we tend to think that we can exclude our feelings. And methods based on data and precise measurements, which were imported into anthropology and sociology from the hardcore discipline. And one fascinating example is Stephen Jay Gould, the scientist himself, wrote this book, The Mismeasure of Men, and he discusses during colonialism, the flourishing of measuring skulls and brains to prove that men are superior to women and that white men are superior to all the other races. I won't get into it, but fascinating and a very, very powerful story of, and scientists, obviously not all scientists agreed, but this belief that if you measure the skull and it's going to be a very, very accurate measurement, then there are no biases and it's just proving what they were after to prove. Which of course is not good science, because in good science, you have to ask an open question and be open to the fact that maybe your hypothesis is wrong.
Edna, so, I'm sorry, I'm just interrupting you. Could you conclude in 1 minute because we don't have much time?
Okay. So I will skip and conclude. Okay. Sorry, I'm just jumping to the end. I cannot really conclude right now, but I will conclude with a poem by Mary Oliver, a poem of the One World. This morning, the beautiful white heron was floating along above the water. And then into the sky of this, the one world we all belong to, where everything sooner or later is a part of everything else. Which thought made me feel for a little while quite beautiful myself. So I will conclude with the hope that we can become to feel that it's really, really one world and that we're connected to all the organisms, not just other humans. Of course, other humans is also not easy for some people. But this connection that we're all one system, and when we hurt another group, whether it's humans or animals or plants, we hurt ourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Edna. I'm sorry I had to stop you. Thank you for giving us your insights on ecofeminism and the topics discussed here. We don't really have time for questions, but we maybe could take like 2 or 3 minutes. I was wondering, since yesterday, actually, about the image of the cat feeders that Shlomit talked about. And I was wondering whether it preserved or undermined gender roles. And I would love to hear what you think about it. And I would also like to hear if one of the speakers from this panel could relate to what is the main struggle or main dilemma you've experienced within ecofeminism. So if anyone would like to respond.
Limor, I didn't understand your first question, so I will start with the second, and then if you can repeat it, I will be happy.
We can talk about it in the break because, but you can refer to the...
I will just say that I think the main struggle in autoethnography is that it's a very emotional field. So when you let your feelings being expressed and when you consider your feelings as a true knowledge, there's a lot of anger and frustration that comes with that. And then there's a problem because eventually you have to organize your feelings into a knowledge, into something written. So how do you do that? So it's one of the difficulties that I'm trying to handle with, because at the end of the day, my goal is to try to construct a way to translate my feelings into an action in the world. So it's really hard, but it's one of the things in this method. Not everything is perfect, but that there are advantages and disadvantages to this method. But I think that in general, it's a very good method to work with animals especially.
Thank you, Shlomit. Would anyone else like to say something about it, share your thoughts before we conclude the session? Okay, so I don't see any raised hands.
Maybe I'll interject one thought that I had about ecofeminism, the difficulty with ecofeminism.
Yeah.
I think, especially in the Israeli experience in Israel, the issue that is considered explosive is the relationship between Israeli Jews and Palestinians. And there I feel that when I try to talk about environmental injustice, for example, the different allocation of land that prioritizes Jews over Palestinians. And it's interesting because I taught for many years, and when I talked about what happened in Australia or North America, everything went smoothly. But when I said, okay, it's a little bit similar, not identical to the situation in Israel, all hell broke loose. So it's not always easy to talk about some of the, and your first question of Shlomit, if I may say something, I think that this is exactly points to the fact that women that feed cats are regarded as crazy, as almost witches, okay? And the danger that it can reinforce stereotypes and how it's not easy to use ecofeminism thought to deconstruct that.
Thank you. I wish we could continue this discussion, but we have to move on. We will take a break now, a 10 minutes break. And I just want to thank again to all the presenters for fascinating talks and enlightening discussion of what we tried to do in the few minutes we had. Please stay with us for the next time slot of this evening, which will start at 7:15. It's called Multi-Species Sites of Engagement 2. And also thanks again for Lori and whoever stayed with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Limor.